the turn of the century, movies reflected the vision of America shared by Thomas Edison and the other men who invented the film industry. Most of these old stock Protestants saw film as an amusement for the working classes. The films presented negative images of hook-nosed Jews, blacks, and others. They championed an idea of America where the white upper classes ruled and immigrants knew their place.
Take one movie, just one movie, biographs the fights of nations. The Jews meet on the street and a policeman comes up to run off one of them who's peddling neckties. One of the other Jews pulls out money and hands it to the policeman as a bribe to let his friend sell the neckties. There is a thread connected to the money, so as the cop walks away smugly, the money pops out of his pocket, back into the Jew's pocket. They're petty merchants, they jabber, and they corrupt cops. It's all so perfect. The blacks, they're in a saloon, and a fight ensues in which a huge razor is pulled. So the blacks dance, they fight over women, and they fight with razors.
The highest artistic achievement of pre-Jewish American cinema was the box office hit Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. The explicitly racist story glorified the Ku Klux Klan and played on white America's fear of racial intermixing. These films reflected popular American values of their era. Ironically, they were being shown in Jewish-run theaters to audiences of Jews and other immigrants.
So I'm going to be reading from the book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. I thought this was quite interesting. Jews and the Great Nat Turner. The Great Nat Turner's 1831 revolt against the slave masters of Virginia was put down with help of at least 2 Jewish militant men. Dr. Henry Myers and Sam Mordecai were mobilized to repel the revolt, and Jewish writer Emma Mordecai described the lynching of Turner's men. If the conduct of the blacks was outrageous, that of the whites was most barbarous towards many of them who were arrested. For instance, they burned off the foot of a Negro whom they had taken upon suspicion and found out that he was innocent. They had one of his ears cut off of another who had to be sure had been guilty of murdering his masters in a most barbarous manner. And after rubbing the wound with sand, they tied him to a horse, had the horse mounted and rode, and then turned loose into the woods. Certainly this Negro deserved to be punished in the most severe manner warranted by civilized society. But this Indian-like treatment casts a great reflection on the troops by whom it was authorized. Jews assisted in crushing other slave uprisings, especially as in New York, when the rebellious slaves belonged to them. Levinson writes, when in 1741 it was discovered that New York Negroes had conspired against the white population and had planned to burn the city, a large number of Negroes were arrested and transported or condemned to death. Some of these slaves belonged to Jewish owners. Cuffy, belonging to Louis Gomez, had planned to burn his master's house. Mikado's house was burned by his Negroes. A few were acquitted, among them servants belonging to Judah Hayes and Samuel Myers Conan.
But in 1912, to escape Edison and the goons he sent to enforce his control of the industry, the future moguls headed west to the orange groves of California. Here they found immediate success.
Now, why did they move to California? I believe that they went there because California was a raw social environment. And although there was a social system in place, it was nowhere near as sophisticated and nowhere near as entrenched as the social hierarchy in Boston or New York or even Chicago, where these moguls came from. So coming to California, they realized that they could create their own social environment. They could create an empire of their own, not only on screen, but within their own lives and their own social environment. And that's precisely what they did.
In 1915, Carl Laemmle had decided to open a very large plant in the valley north of Hollywood, which they called Universal City, and they got themselves a postal designation for Universal City with its own mayor and its own police force, A gigantic facility that includes all necessities for designing films, building sets, photographing them, editing them, costuming them, writing the scripts, housing the executives, all under one piece of property, which he would people with his relatives, very famously brought over from Laupine, Germany. And they were very pleased that this was, the first movie-making city in the world.
Where you all going? Hollywood! Hollywood!
When Jews came to America, it wasn't only Mayflower wasps who seemed to embody America to them. American blacks were quintessential Americans. I mean, that was one of the things that made America, America, the presence of black people. And the indigenous African American culture, and the indigenous African American culture was of tremendous interest. I mean, the music, the dancing, the popular styles, and so on.
Jews served as messengers, in essence, of black culture. They took it, they consumed it, they integrated it into their own cultural repertoire. They took it, they consumed it, they integrated it into their own cultural repertoire, and then introduced it to white America that was essentially willing to listen to Jews and to partake of what Jews had to offer in a way that they never would from blacks.
First on Broadway, and later in the Hollywood musical, this was the way Jewish music often sounded. In writing lyrics, they turned to their Jewish immigrant concerns, of people needing to belong somewhere, needing some kind of redemption through America. The Jews took these themes, but instead of putting them to Jewish music, they borrowed black forms that they saw as authentically American. In a sense, they wrote music in blackface. They wrote music in blackface. They wrote music in blackface.
Coming for to carry me home, sweet Lord, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Oh, I come from the south, from way down south, where the corn and potatoes used to grow. There's great big elegant pictures show, and my old Kentucky home is a French chateau, way down south in Dixie's Willow.
I'm going to read from the Negro Rulers in Scotland and British Isles, page 98. Let it be widely acknowledged that it was not unusually throughout the Middle Ages to paint oneself the opposite of a natural dark complexion. The shades yellow, pink, white, and red were the most favorable colors, especially when having a self-portrait created. Remember, the Renaissance, which means rebirth, was an age of transformation, an era of requiring a new look or appearance in all mode of affairs, changing from the original to something fresh or new. Over 80% of all European portraits before, during, and after the Renaissance was painted from a swarthy complexioned person who chose to change with the times by displaying a white cosmetic powder or painted facial makeup. Nearly all of the remaining darker portraits were gradually secretly altered throughout the centuries to reflect the Caucasian appearance, and like the distorted 80%, was overwhelmingly replaced in nearly every museum, school, book, and academy throughout the world. The cycle of life exemplified that history has a way of repeating itself. During the early Roaring Twenties, many white actors, actresses, and commoners frequently portrayed themselves in blackface. One was the Russian Jew Al Jolson, who received international fame. He and others exemplified the same event, whether loved or hated, that had occurred for centuries throughout Europe. It was popular throughout the Middle Ages to paint the noble or royal class with bright hands, which indicated a person to be a good Christian. This practice soared during the Renaissance, from one hand to the whole body. Unconsciously, today's whites are repeating the latter Middle Ages and Renaissance by sun-tanning themselves with lotions to acquire a darker look. Regardless of the risk, the tragedy is that the average white, as well as the blacks, have been institutionally brainwashed to miscalculate the annals of history.
And what we need to do is we need to keep everything in our neighborhood, everything, black. Black owned with black money. Just like the Jews, the Italians, the Mexicans, and the Koreans do.
Ain't nobody from outside bringing down the property value. It's these folks shooting each other and selling that crack rock and shit.
Well, how you think the crack rock gets into the country? We don't own any planes. We don't own no ships. But we are not the people who are flying and floating that shit in here.